Well, welcome to Mr. Rodman's Top 12 Highlights from Chapter 8. We're looking at public opinion, participation, and voting. Let's start with the number one important factor of political socialization, and that's the family. As we learned about in Chapter 5, and we learned about again in Chapter 4, political socialization comes down to the family. We spend the most time with them than anybody else in our early formative years, and so they are the most important factor when it comes to political socialization. But also remember that sudden drastic events, such as we looked at in class with the public opinion polls, the approval ratings of George W. Bush after 9/11, drastic changes, drastic events, and sudden events such as 9/11 or going to war can definitely change that. We have an attentive public, highly informed citizens, those activists, but we also have apathetic voters. We have people who really don't care, people who are just checked out, the inactives, the voting specialists tend to be attentive public. But the inactives are the ones that don't vote, don't participate, don't want to know about politics, and the participants are within that camp as well. They're just the complainers. Hey, I know all about that pothole, but don't ask me about politics. I really don't care. We have the part-time citizens, 40% of the electorate here. They just vote in presidential elections, where most voters tend to vote. We have more turnout in presidential elections to vote in that than in any other. Public opinion, the idea here of looking at individual preferences for issues, for candidates, for political questions, and other institutions dealing with the population within our country or within our boundaries. We see this measured through polls, a margin of error plus or minus 3%. It's got to be random. It's got to be random. It's got to it has to be random. It has to include a way to randomly select voters, either random digit dialing or random sampling. It needs to be representative of the group. It also needs to contain unbiased questions, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And it also needs to be a pretty broad reach. About 1,000 voters can typically, that are randomly selected, randomly sampled, with this plus or minus 3% margin of error, can really give us a good gauge as to how the country feels, a good 300 million or so. And getting about 1,000 voters to do that is really the key to that public opinion poll that is accurate. Voter interest, we can measure the intensity. We did that with the consensogram activity around the room where we put stickers on the posters dealing with the 12 different issues. We looked at how strongly we felt about those issues in relation to the other issues, the other 11 issues that were on the screen. And then we also looked at whether you supported or opposed those issues. Now, a latency is more opinions that we hold, but we don't really express them. They're just kind of there and not really an issue that we may necessarily talk about. Salience is the idea of prioritization, really the importance. If it was a sticker that got a 1, a 2, or a 3, we know that is pretty important in terms of an issue, and that can change over time. Depending on what's happening in the country, that can become a more pressing issue because of people talking about it or something that happens that really piques our interest. Voting is always going, we hope, is going to always be the most common form of political activity, but we know that Americans tend to do other things to exercise our efficacy, our political efficacy, internally in looking at writing letters, in joining interest groups, in getting involved in campaigns, and sending money to those interest groups and campaigns, and volunteering for campaigns, and going to fundraisers and dinners and rubber chicken dinners and that sort of thing, where where a lot of the campaigning goes on. But voting is the most common form. We do a lot of other things, and we don't necessarily vote, as you can see by the 60% turnout, which is the highest in a presidential election, usually hovering right around 50%, 55. And then in smaller elections like municipal or local elections, municipal being city or county, usually we see a lot less than even 40% in those elections. Tends to be really, really small. If you remember nothing else, remember elections are run by states. The national government does not conduct elections. They are conducted by state by state by state. So they determine voter eligibility. They determine how states set up precincts, how they set up polling places for people to vote, and they vary quite greatly from state to state. Florida versus Ohio, Maryland versus Texas, Ohio versus Maryland. They're all very, very different. But we do hold more elections than any other country for national government, for state government, and for county government or city government, or even town government. All of those are elections, and they are conducted at the state level. So really important to know that the state is conducting those elections. The national government may provide money or funds to those states in the form of mandates, funded or unfunded, but the idea there is that elections are run by the states. Now, the 1993 Motor Voter Law was really designed to boost voter registration, and it did help. We know that registration is automatic in some countries. It is not in ours. Now that is changing. We know the California law, excuse me, that basically said that when you register to get a driver's license or renew your license, you're automatically registered to vote. That is new, and that seems to be gaining ground in terms of getting people registered to vote. But it varies from state to state. Again, because states are the ones that hold elections, they're also the ones that determine voter eligibility. And being registered to vote is one of those requirements in terms of voter eligibility, and that is done state by state by state. Let's talk about elections for a second. We have a whole chapter we're going to cover in Chapter 9 looking at elections, but let's just deal with the most important facts. We know 60% of people vote, and most participate in voting for presidential election years. That's when we really see people come out to vote. In primary elections, this is when you're choosing the candidates. For the general election, the parties are choosing. In Maryland, we have a closed primary, so you must be a registered voter for that party in order to vote in that party's primary. We have off-year or midterm elections, which are the off years, essentially in even numbered years, but not presidential ones. So 2018 will be a midterm. It is the midterm of the president's term, and so this would be an off year or a midterm election. We also see in states like Virginia and New Jersey, we've talked about, where they hold actually elections in the odd numbered years as well. In 2017, they have a race for governor in New Jersey and in Virginia, as well as state delegates and state senators. So those are off-year elections as well, but midterms are the most common form of midterm, are the midterm of the president's term, usually in those even-numbered non-presidential election years like 2018, 2022, etc. Special elections are held when someone dies or resigns or is appointed to a position in the president's cabinet, and so they leave the seat that was held by Tom Price in Georgia. That was a special election that raised more than $20 million for the for the Democrat and Republican candidates in that race. One of the most expensive congressional races in history. And the idea there is it was a special election. So if someone were to pass away or somebody were to resign because they're taking a position in the president's cabinet or leaving Congress altogether, a special election would be held. And again, states determine how that special election is conducted, when it is conducted, and the parameters of how they go about collecting nominations for that bid. How do people vote? One of the most important things you have to remember is turnout. GOTV, getting out the vote. And according to Down's theory of rational choice, we know that we've got to capture the people in the middle, those voters that aren't necessarily Democrats or Republicans, but they're independents, they're moderates. They're the ones that swing to the left and elect Democrats and swing to the right and elect Republicans. So getting out those voters, as well as your party base, is really the key to winning an election. Party identification is important in terms of getting out the vote. Calling all of your Republicans in order to get your Republicans out to vote. Calling all your Democrats in order to get the Democrats out to vote. Or calling up the moderates, those that have signed up for your materials. Those are really critical in terms of getting them out to vote. The candidate appeal, somebody who is more charismatic and energetic and really motivates voters, they really see something in them that they like, is going to be more motivating in getting them out to vote. Also based on the issues. The issues are very important here in getting people out to vote. Valence issues, trying to emphasize the credibility of the candidate on those particular issues in which they agree. Wedge issues, where the candidates see or the voters, excuse me, see differences between the two candidates in terms of how they will vote in representing them. Wedge issues many times can bring people out to vote. Prospective voting, the idea of, well, what are you going to do for me? What are you going to do for me in the future? Versus retrospective, what have you done for me lately? All of these are key aspects of GOTV, or the Get Out the Vote effort, that campaigns will try to rally voters in doing, and it does work. We see negative campaign ads work. We see that on the valence issues or the wedge issues. We see prospective voting or retrospective voting issues in campaign ads. Robocalls, the push polls, all of these things trying to get the voters out to vote on election day in order to swing the election. And then we have voter apathy. We're always going to have that person who wants to stay home to wash the cat. Remember, I said 60% of eligible voters vote in a presidential election, more like 40% in an off year. So that's a lot of people that stay home that could vote but don't. And that's the apathetic voter, the don't wash the cat voter, unfortunately. But that is critical in terms of getting out the vote, in trying to get them off the couch, get them out of their house in terms of washing the cat and getting them out to vote. So which of the following is more likely to vote? You may want to pause it here to take a look. Is it college graduates versus non-college graduates? Older versus younger? Churchgoers versus non-churchgoers? Men versus women? Minorities versus whites? Poorer versus richer? Or rural versus urban? Or Midwest versus Northeast? Pause it here, and then we'll take a look at the answers. Okay, hopefully you've had a chance to take a look at that, and here are those voters who are more likely to vote. We know that the more educated you are, the more likely you are to vote. The older you are, it's those older folks, the retirement home people that are going to Applebee's for the senior citizens discount after they vote on the People Mover bus. They're going out to vote. Churchgoers are much more likely to go and vote their ideological issues. Women vote more than men. Whites vote more than minorities. Wealthier folks tend to vote more than poorer. Rural vote more than urban. And Midwestern voters tend to vote more than Northeastern voters. So there is the breakdown in terms of those that are more likely to vote. That's it for Chapter 8. Hope you found this helpful on the top 12 highlights. Good luck. Live the 5. Vive el cinco. You will do well. I know it.